Um, yeah, so the title for today is actually not this. I'd rather call it Sympathetic Deftness, Adam Smith and Human Resources. Um, Brent Orrell of AEI works on welfare and work, employment, community, doing various studies there at AEI, and reached out to me after he wrote his own piece called, it's on your handout here listed first, STEM Without Fruit. STEM is science, technology, engineering, mathematics studies, but it's also like a STEM, but without fruit was the title of his piece, because what he showed was that a lot of employers nowadays find that their biggest problems with employees is, or one of the biggest problems and a growing problem, is not their expertise in STEM, but their problems actually in soft skills, okay? In relating to people, in coordinating with workmates, in, intersecting, making good contact with the customers, in growing and learning on the job. He calls it soft skills, also social intelligence. But I want to use the term sympathetic deftness. He contacted me because he wanted to know if Adam Smith would have anything to say about these issues that he's dealing with and this issue of soft skills. And we got to talking, and he got me to write this piece. And so this piece is very much what this talk is based on. So let's take working at the car wash. Say Jim is in charge of vacuuming the cars as they come in or out of the line at the at the car wash, and he's having trouble being in sync with the flow, and he's getting kind of aggravated about it. Maybe he's getting angry. So he has a problem in the workplace, and this could be part of the wide issues of trouble in employment. I mean, big issues for Americans, and really this talk is not a political talk. This is about work. It's about finding work, finding your work meaningful, staying employed, and so on. So say Jim is having trouble there in the car wash, and his troubles are being perceived by a coworker, Mary. Maybe she's in charge of putting the cars through the line. So there's an issue of sympathy here, and figuring out what's going on, what might be done about it. On Mary's side, she's got to enter into Jim's troubles. And so that's one part of this sympathy, and she's sort of the main locus of sympathy here. Now, in treating Smith's concept of sympathy, the great Hume, he's also a great Hume scholar, but the great Hume and Smith scholar, Knud Håkansson, offers a nice dissection of sympathy. And let's take the case of Mary entering into Jim's situation here. 4 steps dissection. First, she puts herself into Jim's shoes. That right there is an imaginative act. So it's a first step. Okay? Second step, a sentiment emerges in her own breast, if you will, about what it's like to be in that situation. So she develops a sentiment based on this sort of simulated experience. Okay? Third, she now compares the sentiment she feels through this sort of simulation with the sentiment that Jim is expressing. Okay? And fourth, she now develops a new sentiment based on what happens at the third step. If her sentiment and Jim's sentiment agree or concur, that itself creates a new sentiment of agreement, okay? Or in the case of her judging Jim's conduct, approval, okay? Whereas if at 3, there's a kind of a clash, a significant clash, that might create a kind of antipathy, actually, in this next level, and a kind of disapproval. And Smith said that sympathy in the full 4 steps is pleasurable. in the sense that if we get to the fourth step and we find that we have the same sentiment that Jim has, that there's a pleasure in mutual sentiment. So this is an important point because it kind of it highlights the pleasure in mutual sympathy or mutual sentiment, even if the initial sentiment is not pleasurable. That's why people might actually come away from a hospital visit actually feeling quite fulfilled, you know, because they might be sharing sentiments of fear and pain and misery, but they're sharing them, right? And so at the fourth step, you're getting the pleasure of mutual sympathy. And so this is part of what this soft skills problem in workplaces is about, is figuring out how to be deft in our sentiments, deft in our sympathizing, so that we can get to that pleasure of sympathy. And that smooths the way of figuring out solutions, making things not so bad, finding meaning in the workplace, meaning in our personal lives, and so on. But there's a lot here actually we could talk about. All of this sympathetic deftness has benefits both to Jim and to Mary if they can sort it out. It would also benefit their employer, the car wash, because they've now made the place work better. It'll also benefit the consumers whose place is working better, more competitive, maybe lower prices. So it's win, 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 sympathetic deftness. We just focused a bit on Mary's side, but there are two sides of sympathy. And we've just talked about Mary entering into Jim's situation, and she needs to sort of simulate that experience in her imagination, discover those sentiments of the situation. This entering into side is one set of the social virtue here, and which Smith calls the amiable side, or the amiable virtues. He speaks of the soft, the gentle, the amiable virtues, here shown by Mary. But if Jim seeks help from Mary, he must meet her halfway. He cannot just ache and ooze, grieve and groan. He must buck up enough that she's willing to kind of enter into his situation. All right, so on that side, he needs to not demand too much compassion. People don't enter into people who they feel are asking or demanding too much compassion, okay, and calling too much on other people's attention. And this is the other side of virtue, the respectable virtues. Jim has to show Jim, the one who's sort of experiencing the principal troubles that we're talking about, he has to show the respectable virtues of dignity and so on, of tamping down his own passions, which is basically an active sort of sentiment. And like you say that the more active sentiments you could call passions. You might say the more passive sentiments are emotions. So you might have a kind of division between emotions and passions amongst sentiments. So Jim has to show the respectable. Mary, he's here showing the amiable. Smith does gender these two sides. There is gendering in TMS, the theory of moral sentiments. So it's not by accident that I've made it Mary and Jim. However, if Jim is to buck up and show those respectable virtues, so as to help Mary to be able to enter into his situation, in a way, he must understand her situation, because her situation is entering into his situation. And so he now has to be amiable, right? So you need the female to do the male. And Smith says this very clearly. There's a sort of androgyny in moving up in virtue. You need both the amiable side and the respectable side. And for that matter, if Mary is to enter into Jim's situation, she has to imagine not only what it's like to try to vacuum the floors of the rugs in the cars, she has to imagine what it's like for him to buck up, right? And so she has to think about his respectable virtues. So the better she understands respectable virtues, the better she will actually be in the amiable virtue of entering into Jim's situation of needing to show respectable virtue. You see? So Smith says this very clearly, and it's clearly a sort of androgyny in virtue. The man who feels the most for the joys and sorrows of others is best fitted for acquiring the most complete control of his own joys and sorrows, okay? So the man who's most amiable is best fitted to be respectable, you see? You can also think of this kind of looping relationship here as sympathizing with the burden. Like if you fail to buck up, if you show a lack of respectability, sympathizing with the burden that places on other people. So again, you kind of see the kind of second order amiability here. You might relate this to some of Jordan Peterson's 12 Rules for Life, which have many of them have a kind of very respectable virtue, buck up feeling, but there is amiability behind this respectability because we're sympathizing with the burden that comes from the disorder in the burden on others that comes from disorder in our own lives. So Jim and Mary are in the workplace. They're interested in getting these resources and activities combined or concatenated, that is to say sort of organized or chained, concatenated to produce certain results. They want that concatenation to be better rather than worse, or better coordinated in that concatenation, kind of like a coordination of colors, if you like, in interior decorating. And to do this, they need to mutually coordinate their activities, okay? To produce this overall better coordination of the concatenation. Now, this is kind of my pet way of talking about certain things, but I'm sort of defining that way a word which is very crucial. What's the word? They need to, say again? Concatenate. They need to cooperate. Cooperate involves us mutually coordinating to advance the better coordination of a mutually perceived and understood concatenation, okay, which achieves certain ends and goals. I know that's kind of complicated, but so we got to the word cooperate. And I want you to think of this word a little bit like cooperate. Like Josh and I cooperate this thing. Kind of like Lennon and McCartney co-wrote that song, okay? That's got the right flavor, actually, for what's going on here and how the workplace obviously then calls for cooperation. And I'm saying sympathetic deftness is being a good cooperator, okay? Now, in the workplace, we generally start to interact, some of you could say this probably about people sitting next to you, with some regularity. And a kind of habitual sympathy, Smith had a word for. Habitual sympathy. Affection. Affection. What is called affection is in reality, I'm quoting, is in reality nothing but habitual sympathy. Now, we speak easily of affection towards friends and family, but it does also arise among familiars in the workplace, as I'm sure you know, and we might then speak of a workmate or even a work spouse. Smith, let me read a little passage about this from Smith. Colleagues in office, partners in trade, call one another brothers and frequently feel towards one another as if they really were so. Their good agreement is an advantage to all. Romans expressed this sort of attachment by the word necessitudo, which from the etymology seems to denote that it was imposed by the necessity of the situation. It's a great word, necessitudo. It's spelled just like it sounds, and it's part of the job, okay? It calls on you to get along and to find a kind of affection with your workmates, even if in other circumstances, you wouldn't necessarily buddy up and feel so much affection towards this person. But because it's your workmate, or because it's a neighbor, or because it's a brother-in-law, necessitudo calls for you to develop this affection, okay, this habitual sympathy. So that's part of sympathetic deftness. In the workplace, again, you know, not just your troubles, but all sorts of quirky passions might disturb or rankle your workmates. And so another way, again, to think about this is a command of your passions. This is maybe especially on the respectable side. Smith wrote a great deal about self-command. So I just want to make that note. Now, sympathetic deftness clearly has this strong social flavor to it. Ethicists sometimes sort of broadly bring two different lenses to different virtues, the more social virtues, and then the ones that are more, as it were, about kind of looking after yourself, which falls under the heading of prudence. Now, prudence is also, of course, really important here. Why? We can focus on the expression reputation. Okay? If you rankle people, they might damage your reputation. If you delight your workmates, they will enhance it. Reputation, after all, is other people's estimation of you, as expressed in their own words, for example, of your merit and trustworthiness. It starts locally, but it extends further. You can think how far your reputation extends when it is conveyed in a credit record, a credit report sent by, say, Experian or TransUnion or Equifax to potential employers or creditors or landowners. And Smith talked about quite a bit about the importance of reputation as a glue in the modern world. He wrote about dealers making 20 contracts a day, and that the dealer cannot gain so much by endeavoring to impose on his neighbors as the very appearance of being a cheat would make him lose. And whenever we're dealing frequently, you don't expect to gain so much by any one contract as by the probity and punctuality in the whole of your dealings. And you'd rather lose in one particular case what you have a right to than give any grounds for suspicion. So Smith's saying, in fact, that we're all often involved in repeated dealings like this in this modern new setting of the modern world. Every man lives thus as a merchant, he says, and we develop a commercial society. Okay. And as merchants and others, we makes us honest and trustworthy even with strangers. And these practices and habits, he says, therefore make probity and punctuality the principal virtues of a commercial nation. So he actually saw commerce as a virtue-raising activity and practice in the modern world. Commerce didn't run virtue down, it actually brought people up for these reputational reasons. So reputation is a sort of glue to markets, but I want to bring it back deeper and realize that sympathy is a glue to reputation, because it's only through sympathizing that we understand what the situation was, who did what to whom, whose sentiments are just and unjust in that situation. Sympathy is a glue to reputation, which is a glue to markets. So underneath it is the important personal, emotional matter of sympathy. Now, in this conduct that Jim is exhibiting, he expresses his character. He shows his character, which is his sort of purposes, you could say. What sort of purposes drive his conduct is one way to think about characters. And employers are always interested to learn the character of an employee. What motivates Jim? Is he trustworthy? Does he strive to improve his abilities? Does he show concern for coworkers and customers? Does he understand, say, necessitudo? So coworkers working with Jim need to get a sense of this underlying character, okay? But again, going kind of deeper, as Smith always does, even behind character, they want to get a sense of his conscience. Okay, so I want to say a little bit about conscience here, because it's actually another seat of sympathy and another place, another seat for one to develop sympathetic deftness. When Jim acts in a way that is objectionable to his conscience, he might feel that even with himself. And you can think of that as a kind of antipathy, okay? How is this a sense of antipathy? Well, you got to now start dividing Jim, okay? And Smith does exactly that. His expression for the conscience is the man within the breast. So now we've got Jim who does something at work, and maybe shortly thereafter, maybe that evening, he senses that the man within his breast disapproves of what he did. So the man within the breast has, as it were, entered into Jim's situation in that amiable way, developed a sentiment which doesn't agree with what Jim did. And now there's that antipathy and disapproval, which Jim now feels, we hope, because we're not always in good communication with our man within the breast. Also, our man within the breast might be sleeping. We have all sorts of problems with our man within. Also, the man in the breast could just be off. However, it's what we've got to work with. And it's better than not having anybody in there and being totally asleep. We've got to hope. But anyway, through this experience of, say, disapproval, Jim may learn to correct his habits and improve his conduct, okay? So he's got a sort of reputation with his own man within the breast here, you might say, kind of like how skeptically his conscience looks at what he does. Some people don't seem to be too bothered by their conscience at all, right? Now, let me just go a little crazier. It's not, so crazy. Maybe you've heard me talk about this before, but turns out that in Smith, your man within the breast is actually the representative of a godlike being who's super knowledgeable and universally benevolent. Okay, you can think of this as God, particularly if you're a theist. You can think of it as a godlike being with those godlike characteristics. Maybe you want to think of it as allegorical. But the point is that the man within the breast is a representative, not necessarily a great representative. Your conscience is a representative of a universal being of that sort. In fact, if you go deep enough, that being is who each of our man within the breasts is a representative of. Even though our man within the breasts vary, even if that being is universal. Okay? But the point is that Jim wants the pleasure of the sympathy with the man within the breast. This is a kind of soul sympathy. And it does bring it home. At the end of the day, you're going to bed and you think about what you've done, or maybe you don't think about it so thoroughly, but you might kind of assess, like, whether you've sort of done good or done bad, you've done your duty, and so on. And that's this soul sympathy that's so important. And that when you get certain feedback at that fourth step, you might, reflect and correct your own judgment, your own conduct, okay? So Jim might ask himself, was I kind of a jerk in what I did yesterday? And we hope he's ready to admit that maybe he was a jerk. Now, bring it back a little bit more mundane. What does he do when he asks himself, was I a jerk yesterday? Very often when we're all alone, we just get absorbed in our own point of view, our own problems, our own sort of sentiments, initial sentiments, kind of that empirical, momentary sentiment. And we brood. Smith says, we are apt to feel too strongly whatever relates to ourselves. This is when we're sitting at home alone and brooding. We are apt to overrate the good offices we may have done and the injuries we may have suffered. The conversation of a friend brings us to a better, that of a stranger to a still better temper. The man within the breast requires often to be awakened and put in mind of his duty by the presence of the real spectator. That is to say, when you talk to maybe your parent, your spouse, your friend, whatever, that that actually, first of all, you get that person's feedback, and then that person enters in, here's your troubles, we're talking about a friend, someone with this affection, and you get that kind of feedback, but also this whole process then has to be reviewed by your man within the breast, and so your man within the breast is also awakened in all this. So talking to those who you live with, a familiar, is very important. And when I do this every day with my wife, by the way, even though she's generally on the other side of the Atlantic. Report the matter candidly, okay? Let the friend imagine the situation and discover her own sentiment in the simulated situation, and listen to your friend's feedback. And find friends who give you kind of frank feedback. However, friends and family are counselors, and they have habits of sympathizing with us. They feel affection for us. And they know us better than other people do. But there's a problem in all this, and that's that we develop and maintain friendships with people who tend to take our side. We like people like us. Notice the two different meanings of the word like. It's not an accident, folks. Similarly, listen to this one. Those who are most kind to us are those of our own kind. That's not an accident either. Kind, kindred, you see? Our friends are partial towards us, okay? And now a certain partiality is no doubt a part of friendship, but it is not good if they totally neglect the situation of the other party to a dispute. They don't get to hear that person's side of the story. And notice what Smith said when I just quoted him a moment ago. The conversation of a stranger brings us to an even better temper. We can venture, he says, this is a quote, to express our emotion in the presence of a friend more than in that of a stranger, because we expect more indulgence from a friend than from a stranger. You may have experienced this, I'm sure, all the time, like if you ever end up sitting and talking in depth with someone sitting next to you on an airplane who's a stranger, and you don't expect too much sympathy, but maybe you try to warm them up into it over the course of this flight. But the point here is that, so even the feedback of our friends need review, and that the interaction and feedback from unfamiliars, not hostile strangers, not enemies, but unfamiliars, customers, workmates that maybe you don't interact so regularly with, just other people you meet in social encounters. That's important too, and it kind of puts us in this frame of mind of a more basic kind of human expectation of what's reasonable, what presumptions we start with, or which you might relate to common decency, okay? So the kind of the world of unfamiliars, we have to develop this sense of common decency, which again is a matter for sympathy and sympathetic deftness. And Smith says that our hope is that the development brings forth this, development of human life, the, quote, just man who has been thoroughly bred in the great school of self-command in the bustle and business of the world. So you see, he had a very socially active view of how to develop virtue. It's not just about, oh, I'm going to be the fool on the hill and study my books and, have little personal discussions with my Yoda pupils and be wise. It's a kind of worldliness, okay? Because it's all these different seats of sympathy. There's three now, if you think about it. There's familiars, there's unfamiliars, and there's the soul, if you will, soul sympathy. All of these depend on each other, okay, and interact, and can help with, and you sort of develop the sympathetic deftness through all of these. And in the bustle and business of the world, we see ourselves at a distance because we take that kind of general common decency point of view, and that we are but a small part of the greater whole, and we thereby learn to care for the well-being of that greater whole. That's kind of like the universal benevolence point of view of the godlike being. We can't actually be like God that way, but we try to move in that direction. So is the theory of moral sentiments useful in all this? Again, we've got these three seats of sympathy with familiars, with unfamiliars, and with the man within the breast, or soul sympathy. All three of these call for this kind of sympathetic deftness, with the amiable side and the respectable side applying in each case. And those are two really quite different sorts of sets of virtues. And I think it's a useful way of organizing our thinking about it. Yeah, and so to bring it back to the workplace, it's important, I want to also add, that people sort of support the organization they work for. That is a kind of precondition of getting all of this done in the workplace, of getting the cooperation, getting the sympathy, because it's all about advancing the coordination of the workplace's concatenation of the job of the workplace. And so it's so important. This does get us a bit into politics now. It's so important that people have attitudes that suit organizations. And I'm thinking now just about private enterprises pursuing honest income, especially. And it's really important for them to understand the beneficialness of the pursuit of honest income, of the achieving of honest income by a private enterprise. Because if they don't see that as conducing to the larger whole and to the goodness of society, the whole base precondition for this sympathy in the whole process is going to be, it's going to be impossible, really. And so that gets us into people appreciating the pursuit of honest income, which is another matter. But at any rate, I suggest that our sympathetic deftness can actually be enhanced by actually learning more from Smith. It's not just politics. It's actually like self-help. Thank you for your attention.